Sarah Collins sat at her desk, the harsh fluorescent lights above flickering ever so slightly as she typed out an email. The noise of the office was a constant hum, murmurs of conversations, the tapping of keyboards, and the occasional ringing of phones. It was a typical Tuesday morning at Madison and Graves marketing firm. Sarah had worked her way up to a mid-level management position at the firm, a job she was proud of. She was smart, driven, and passionate about her work. The kind of person who gave her best, always. But lately, there was a growing unease that gnawed at her confidence. Her body, something she had always been self-conscious about, felt like the focal point of every uncomfortable glance and whispered comment. She brushed the thought aside as she clicked send on the email. Her work was solid. Her ideas were strong. But it didn't feel like enough. It was the same every day. She had spent the past few years at the firm trying to prove herself. She worked long hours, delivered results, and went above and beyond for her clients. But no matter how hard she worked, it always felt like something was missing. Or, rather, like something was wrong with her. At the morning meeting, the tension in the air was palpable as Sarah entered the conference room, her colleagues already seated. She took her place at the table, her back straight, her posture professional, nothing to indicate the nervous flutter in her stomach. Jason, one of the junior managers, greeted her with a smile, though his eyes lingered a moment too long on her figure. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Sarah noticed. "All right, team," said Lucas, their boss, clapping his hands. "We've got a lot to go over today. Let's start with Sarah's proposal for the new campaign." Sarah glanced at her notes, then up at her colleagues. She felt their eyes on her, some supportive, some indifferent, and others, calculating. She began speaking, her voice steady, rehearsed. "Our target demographic is mid to high-income women between the ages of 25 and 40, and then it happened." As she outlined her ideas, one of her co-workers, Emily, interrupted with a comment. "That's a great pitch, Sarah, but maybe you should lose the carbs next time. You know, if you're really trying to reach those women." A few heads nodded, others stifled a chuckle. The weight of the words settled in Sarah's chest like a brick, and she froze for a moment. The room had shifted slightly, like the air had thickened. "Not sure how many women will want to listen to advice from someone who's not exactly diet goals," Emily added, her voice dripping with false sweetness. There was a brief, uncomfortable silence before Lucas cleared his throat and continued the meeting, but the damage was done. Sarah's face burned, her hands slightly shaking. She forced herself to look back at her slides and finish the presentation. She wasn't going to let them see how much that hurt. But it stung. Later that afternoon, Sarah sat at her desk, staring at the report she was supposed to review, but her mind wasn't on the numbers. She was replaying the meeting in her head, trying to justify the cruel words that had been thrown at her. Emily's words echoed again and again. "Not exactly diet goals." She exhaled sharply, trying to shake off the lingering embarrassment, but it was hard to escape the feeling of being watched, judged. It wasn't the first time someone had made a snide remark about her weight, but it was the first time it had been so public. She was used to the whispers, the sideways glances, the well-meaning suggestions to try this diet or get some exercise. But today felt different. Emily's words weren't just about her body, they were about her worth. Her professional worth. That evening, Sarah walked through the door of her apartment and was greeted by James, her husband, who pulled her into a tight hug. "Hey, how was your day?" he asked, his voice warm and full of affection. She rested her head against his chest for a moment, letting his scent, the comforting mixture of coffee and woodsy cologne, wash over her. "Busy," she said softly, her voice catching. "But I don't know. I just feel tired." James pulled back, searching her face with concern. "Tired from work, or something else?" Sarah hesitated. She had always been able to talk to James, but tonight, the weight of the day felt too much to put into words. "It's just, I don't know. It's the usual stuff. The office. The comments. The looks," she finally said, her voice breaking. "I don't know how much longer I can take it, James." He sat down beside her, rubbing her arm gently. "What happened?" "Emily made a comment today. About my weight. In front of everyone, in the meeting. I was presenting, and she just said." Sarah's throat tightened. She swallowed hard. "She said I'm not diet goals." James' face immediately hardened, his brows furrowing. "Sarah. I'm sorry. I hate that they make you feel like this." She looked at him, the exhaustion in her eyes palpable. I don't know how to handle it anymore. It's like they only see me for how I look. Not for the work I do, not for the ideas I bring to the table, just how I look." James took a deep breath. "You are so much more than what anyone sees on the outside. You know that, right?" "I know, but it doesn't feel like it," she whispered. James took her hand, squeezing it gently. "You're the smartest, most hard-working person I know. And you deserve to be treated with respect. If they can't see that, then they're the ones who have the problem, not you." "I just feel so small sometimes, James," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Like I'm invisible. Or worse, like I'm not good enough." James pulled her closer, wrapping his arms around her. "You are more than enough. And I'm proud of everything you've accomplished. You're stronger than you know." His words were comforting, but they couldn't erase the sting of what she had been through that day. As they sat there together, the weight of Sarah's frustration and hurt still lingered, but there was a shift inside her. James' words, though kind and supportive, also made her realize something. She couldn't keep letting the actions of others define her. She couldn't let the harsh words and the judgmental looks steal her sense of self-worth. It was time for her to stop hiding behind her self-doubt and start standing up for herself. Later that evening, Sarah lay in bed, her thoughts racing. Her mind drifted to a new possibility: maybe it was time to make a change. She had always put others first, always worked hard to please her colleagues, her clients, and everyone around her. But she couldn't keep living like this. She couldn't keep letting people's hurtful words dictate how she saw herself. For the first time in a long time, Sarah realized something deep inside: she didn't have to be invisible anymore. She didn't have to let her insecurities keep her from embracing her worth. As she closed her eyes, the weight on her chest felt a little lighter. There was still a long road ahead, but for the first time, she felt like she was ready to stand up for herself. Ready to take control of her life. James sat in his small, cluttered office, the faint hum of the fluorescent lights above filling the silence. The phone in his hand buzzed again, and this time, he didn't hesitate. He knew what the call was about. It had been a long week, full of meetings, negotiations, and countless emails, but none of that mattered now. He lifted the receiver and pressed it to his ear. "James." "Congratulations, James," the voice on the other end of the line said, steady and confident. "You're officially the new CEO. The company's been bought out, and the board unanimously voted you in." They want you to lead. For a moment, everything froze. His heart pounded in his chest, and a quiet euphoria flooded him. This was the moment he'd been working toward his entire career. This was his dream come true. "Thank you," James said, the words feeling surreal. "I won't let you down." "I know you won't. We're counting on you." The line clicked as the call ended, leaving James alone in the sterile quiet of his office. The gravity of the situation slowly sank in. CEO. He was the one now making the decisions. He was at the helm of a fast-growing tech company, responsible for guiding it to new heights. He had the power, the influence, the resources. But even as he sat back in his chair and stared at the papers in front of him, another thought quickly followed. Sarah. His heart twisted at the thought of her. He'd spent so much time building his career, but Sarah had been struggling. It had been months since she'd told him about the bullying at work. The cruel comments, the isolation, the way her colleagues had made her feel small and invisible. It pained him to know she'd been enduring all of that without his full understanding of the depth of her pain. But now, things were different. He had power. Real power. And he was determined to use it not just for the company, but for her. Sarah was sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through her phone, when James walked in. He could tell right away that something was off. Her eyes were tired, her posture slumped as she absent-mindedly flicked through news stories. He stood in the doorway for a moment, just watching her. The woman he loved, the woman who had supported him through every high and low in his career, was hurting. And now, with this promotion, he finally had the tools to make things right. He cleared his throat, pulling her attention away from the screen. "Hey." Sarah looked up, her lips curving into a small smile. "Hey, yourself. How was the meeting?" James hesitated, unsure how to begin. But then he realized there was no easy way to say it. "I've been made CEO," he said quietly, walking toward her. Her eyes widened in surprise. "Wait, what? Seriously?" James nodded, a grin breaking across his face despite the tension still lingering in the air. "Yeah. I'm the new CEO of the company. They bought us out and, well, I'm running the show now." A laugh bubbled up from Sarah's chest, but it wasn't entirely happy. "I'm happy for you, James. This is a huge achievement. You deserve it." She stood up and walked toward him, wrapping her arms around his waist. The familiar scent of her perfume comforted him. He could feel her warmth, but there was a distance in her embrace. Something was still weighing on her mind. He pulled back, his hands resting on her shoulders. "You don't look like you're celebrating. What's going on?" Sarah sighed and looked away, out the window. I'm glad for you. But I don't know, conflicted. I'm not sure if I want to just let you swoop in and fix everything. It's not like I'm weak or need you to solve my problems. I can handle things on my own, you know." James frowned. He understood where she was coming from, but he couldn't stand the thought of her continuing to face the daily torment at work alone. "I know you're strong," he said softly, his fingers gently lifting her chin so she had to meet his gaze. "But I don't think that means you have to fight alone. Not anymore. I've got the power to help you, Sarah. And I will. You deserve better than what they've been putting you through." She bit her lip, her eyes full of hesitation. "James, I don't want people thinking I'm just, well, using you. I don't want them to think that just because you're the CEO now, I'm expecting you to fix things for me. I don't care what anyone thinks, James said, his voice firm. You're not using me. But I'm your husband. I'm supposed to help you. And if this bullying is still going on at work, I'm going to do something about it. I'll make sure those people know that what they've been doing is wrong. Sarah hesitated for a long moment before finally nodding. You really think you can do something about it? I know I can. There was silence between them, heavy and unspoken. Sarah finally broke it with a soft sigh. Okay. If you're sure. James smiled, a feeling of relief washing over him. He hadn't expected it to be easy, but he wasn't going to back down. I'm sure. The next day, James was back in his new office, a sprawling suite on the top floor of the startup's headquarters. It was everything he had ever imagined: sleek glass windows offering a panoramic view of the city below, a minimalist design, and the faint smell of fresh paint still lingering in the air. But as he sat at the massive desk, reviewing reports and meeting with his leadership team, his mind kept returning to Sarah and her tormentors. The board had made him CEO for a reason. They trusted his vision, his strategy, and his ability to lead. But this wasn't about numbers or products. This was personal. This was about the people he cared about: his wife, his family. James made a decision. He wouldn't just change the company's direction. He'd change its culture. He stood up and walked to the glass window, looking out at the city as a wave of determination washed over him. This was his moment, his chance to make a real impact. He couldn't wait to meet with the company's HR team to discuss a company-wide overhaul, one where respect, empathy, and diversity would no longer be optional. His first step? A company-wide meeting to announce his vision. A new culture. And he'd make it clear no one would be allowed to treat others like Sarah had been treated. Later that day, after another long string of meetings, James sat alone in his office, reviewing his notes for the upcoming announcement. The changes he intended to make would be sweeping, but necessary. He felt the weight of the responsibility on his shoulders, but for the first time in years, it felt like the weight was right. He took a deep breath and picked up his phone, dialing Sarah's number. She answered after the third ring. Hey. Hey, he said, his voice low. I just wanted you to know I'm serious about this. I'm going to do everything I can to make sure your workplace changes. I won't let them keep doing this to you. Sarah's voice was soft but full of gratitude. I know. I don't know if I'm ready for everyone to know. I don't want anyone to think I'm weak. You're not weak, James replied, his tone resolute. You're stronger than anyone I know. And you don't have to fight this battle alone. Not anymore. She paused for a moment. Okay. If you think it'll help, then I'm with you. James exhaled, a feeling of finality settling over him. It's going to help. I'll make sure of it. James sat in the back corner of his newly appointed office, the walls adorned with sleek, minimalist decor that felt cold compared to the warmth of his former, more humble space. As the new CEO, his world had shifted dramatically, but his focus wasn't entirely on corporate strategy or quarterly earnings reports. It was on Sarah. The way she came home each night, her eyes tired and defeated, her shoulders slumped under the invisible weight of the workplace. James had tried to comfort her, to encourage her to speak up, but she always deflected, always told him that things would get better, that they had to. But it was clear to him now it wouldn't get better unless something changed. He was the change. His first order of business, though, wasn't to approach Sarah directly. That would be too obvious. Instead, he'd gone under the radar, conducting his own quiet investigation into the source of the bullying at the company. No one knew about it yet, not Sarah, not the staff, but James had begun conducting anonymous surveys and holding interviews with employees from various departments. It didn't take long for the truth to unravel. The findings were even more horrifying than he'd anticipated. The bullying wasn't just happening to Sarah, it was rampant throughout the company. Body shaming, sexism, and manipulation were deeply embedded in the company's culture, and the people who perpetuated these behaviors weren't subtle about it. James had always known that corporate environments could be cutthroat, but this was toxic to its core. He found that many of Sarah's colleagues, the ones who made snide comments about her clothes, her weight, her professionalism, had long histories of this behavior. Sarah's torment was merely the latest chapter in a tale of cruelty. It was systematic, encouraged by the unchecked behavior of certain senior managers, who wielded their power like weapons. As the data piled up, James's resolve strengthened. He couldn't let it continue. These people had to be held accountable. Sarah's struggle continues. Meanwhile, Sarah was doing her best to hold it together, even as the weight of the office's hostility pressed down on her every day. She walked into the office every morning with the familiar sense of dread, forcing herself to ignore the whispers that followed her through the hallways, the side glances from colleagues when she passed by, and the constant stream of microaggressions that chipped away at her confidence. "How's the diet going?" Jessica, one of the more passive-aggressive senior analysts, had asked that morning, her tone sweet but laced with an undercurrent of cruelty. Sarah had smiled weakly, her hands clenching into fists beneath her desk. "Don't react," she reminded herself. "Just focus on the work." But it was hard to focus when every day felt like an emotional battle. It wasn't just the insults anymore, it was the constant exhaustion, the toll it took on her mental health, on her sense of self-worth. She had become numb to the remarks, the little jabs and snide comments, but she could feel the cracks forming inside her. Every part of her wanted to push back, to tell someone, but she had been conditioned to believe that doing so would cost her job, her career, everything she had worked for. Instead, Sarah continued to keep her head down. She wasn't one to make waves. She wasn't one to draw attention to herself. If she just kept quiet, just kept doing her job, maybe it would all blow over. But deep down, she knew she couldn't continue like this forever. She didn't want to leave the company. It wasn't fair to have to leave something she loved because of a handful of bullies. But she also couldn't shake the feeling that she was running out of options. A turning point for James. Back at his desk, James was no longer thinking about quarterly profits or corporate restructuring. His focus was razor sharp. His investigations had confirmed what he'd suspected: senior leadership had long turned a blind eye to the toxic culture. It was not just the staff members who bullied Sarah, it was the environment itself, a culture that had been created and allowed to thrive at the highest levels of the company. He couldn't change it all at once, that would be too conspicuous, too risky. But he could take the first steps toward righting these wrongs. With a few phone calls and a couple of quiet meetings with trusted allies in HR and leadership, James began to craft his plan. He would start with the worst offenders, those who had directly contributed to Sarah's suffering. They would be dealt with swiftly and decisively. One by one, he quietly pulled strings behind the scenes, using his newfound position as CEO to move against the senior managers who had made Sarah's life miserable. The manipulative and passive-aggressive behaviors that had been allowed to fester would no longer be tolerated. He wasn't just going to fire them, he was going to make it clear that their actions had consequences. He had the authority now, and he was going to use it. As the names of the senior managers who had bullied Sarah and others were culled from the list, James couldn't help but feel a surge of satisfaction. This was only the beginning. The change he had been waiting for was about to begin. The quiet firings. By the end of the week, James had quietly terminated a few key senior managers, people who had been integral to the company's toxic environment. The firings were framed as part of a larger corporate shift toward a more inclusive and supportive culture, something that James had already been planning to implement in his new role. He didn't want to raise suspicion by making it too personal, so he handled it through the proper channels, making sure that the explanations for their departures were framed in a way that wouldn't draw too much attention. The managers were immediately escorted out, their computers and personal belongings packed up by HR. The news rippled through the company like a quiet storm, but it was a storm nonetheless. Those who had been involved in the bullying, the ones who had made snide comments about Sarah's appearance, her work ethic, her position, now felt the heat of accountability. For Sarah, it wasn't immediate. She didn't know that the wheels of change had started turning, that the people who had tormented her were already being dealt with. She simply noticed the shift in the office atmosphere. It was subtle at first. People began treating her with more respect. Her work was no longer met with condescension. Jessica no longer asked her about the diet with that sickly sweetness. Her team, who had once looked at her with thinly veiled contempt, now spoke to her as though she were an equal. And for the first time in a long time, Sarah started to feel something she hadn't felt in a while: hope. Sarah's confusion. Sarah had always been used to walking through the halls of her company with a sense of quiet apprehension, her every move observed by colleagues who treated her with cold indifference or outright disdain. For years, she had weathered the silent whispers, the subtle jabs, the backhanded compliments, little acts of aggression that left her feeling small and powerless. But over the last few weeks, something strange had begun to happen. It started with small gestures. A colleague who had previously ignored her now smiled when they passed each other in the break room. Another offered help with a project, something she would have never expected before. The shift was so subtle that Sarah almost thought she was imagining it. But as time passed, it became undeniable. Her workplace seemed different. People were being more polite, more accommodating, more cooperative. But there was something off about it, too. The bullying, though less overt, hadn't stopped. It was as if the antagonism had shifted, become more passive, more insidious, like the perpetrators were now more careful. They no longer made their hostility as apparent, but it still lingered in the way they avoided eye contact, or the occasional quiet snicker when they thought she wasn't paying attention. It left Sarah feeling uneasy. She couldn't put her finger on it. Why had things changed? What was behind it? James's revelations. One evening, after a long day at the office, Sarah came home to find James sitting in the living room, a rare look of seriousness on his face. He wasn't the usual charming, playful husband she was accustomed to. His demeanor was solemn, his eyes shadowed with something unreadable. She set her bag down on the counter and joined him on the couch, instinctively sensing that something important was coming. "Sarah," he began, his voice low, "we need to talk." She frowned, her fingers instinctively curling around the edge of the cushion. "What's going on, James? You're scaring me." James let out a sigh, running a hand through his hair. "I've been keeping something from you, something that's been bothering me for a while now." He met her gaze, his eyes filled with an intensity that immediately put her on edge. "I've been using my position to handle some of the people at your company. The ones who've been making your life miserable." Sarah blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean, handle them?" "I've taken care of a few of them, James continued, his tone deliberate. I've made sure they don't get in your way anymore. There was a moment of stunned silence between them. Sarah's mind raced, trying to process what he was saying. James, you didn't, she whispered, the realization dawning on her. I did, he confirmed. I made some moves, made sure they knew their place. The ones who've been bullying you. They're either on their way out or they've been reined in. You shouldn't have to deal with them anymore. Sarah sat back, a swirl of conflicting emotions hitting her all at once. Part of her wanted to feel grateful, wanted to believe that James had done this out of love for her, out of a desire to protect her from the torment she had endured. But another part of her, the part that still tried to rationalize the situation, felt guilty. She felt guilty that James had gone so far, using his power and influence to meddle in her world. You shouldn't have done that, she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. I can handle myself. I don't want you fighting my battles for me. James's expression softened, and he moved closer, taking her hands in his. I know you're strong, Sarah. But I'm your husband. And I won't stand by and let people treat you like that. Not anymore. Tears welled in her eyes, and she blinked them away quickly. She was torn between wanting to be strong on her own and being touched by the lengths James had gone to for her. But the more she thought about it, the more her sense of unease grew. Was it truly love that had driven him to do this, or was there something else at play? She sighed, her voice thick with emotion. I don't know how to feel, James. Part of me is relieved. But another part of me feels like you've crossed a line. James seemed to understand. He squeezed her hands gently. I know it's complicated. But I won't let them hurt you. Not ever again. The power struggle the next few days at work were a whirlwind of strange encounters. Colleagues who had once turned a blind eye to her were now offering words of encouragement, and though their gestures seemed sincere, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The change was too sudden, too orchestrated. The subtle tension in the air had shifted, replaced by a quiet uncertainty. It was as if everyone was waiting for something, waiting for the other shoe to drop. And drop it did. As James's influence continued to grow, so too did the power struggle within the company. Some of the top executives who had likely benefited from keeping things as they were began to question James's leadership. Whispers of his decisions being too aggressive or too personal started to spread through the office. Some began to wonder if his actions, his interventions in company politics, were creating more problems than they were solving. Sarah watched, her stomach twisting, as the once smooth waters of her professional world began to ripple with tension. She knew her husband, and she knew how determined he could be when it came to getting what he wanted. But she also knew the consequences of unchecked power, of people pushing back against someone who had shaken things up too much. She could feel the pressure building, and it was only a matter of time before it would boil over. One afternoon, after a tense meeting between James and some of the board members, Sarah found herself alone in their office, staring out the window at the city below. She couldn't help but feel a growing sense of dread. What had started as an act of protection, of love, had now become something more dangerous, something that might cost them both. That night, after dinner, Sarah confronted James in their bedroom. The weight of everything, the guilt, the uncertainty, the realization of how far things had gone hung heavy in the air. James, I need you to stop, she said, her voice shaking slightly. This isn't just about me anymore. This is affecting you, too. What if this backfires? What if you've made things worse? James stood still for a moment, the same quiet intensity in his eyes. I'm doing this for you, Sarah. I love you. I won't let you suffer at their hands anymore. She reached out, placing a hand gently on his chest. But it's not just about them. It's about us. About our lives. You're fighting a battle that's bigger than us, and I'm scared we're both going to lose. James's face softened, but he didn't let go of his resolve. I'll handle it. I promise. Sarah wasn't so sure anymore. As much as she appreciated his efforts, she knew that the ripple effect of his actions was far from over. She had witnessed enough power struggles in the corporate world to know how dangerous they could become, and this one, she feared, was only just beginning. The boardroom felt colder than usual. The polished glass table reflected the tense faces of James's leadership team, all of them sitting in a circle, eyes fixed on him with varying degrees of skepticism. The air was thick with the scent of formaldehyde, the lingering trace of old decisions and failed promises. James sat at the head of the table, his posture straight but his mind miles away from the corporate agenda. He had expected this. He had known it was coming. The first whispers of dissent had surfaced within days of his aggressive overhaul of the company's culture. But now, in the face of a formal board meeting, it was official. The question of his leadership was on the table. James, Carl, the head of finance, said with a pointed look, the company is hemorrhaging in the market. We've had complaints from major clients, and employees are beginning to question your methods. I'm all for cleaning up the company culture, but your approach, he paused, clearly searching for the right words, it's been drastic. Some are wondering if it's personal. There's a lot of discomfort, and the media's starting to catch on. James kept his gaze steady, though the weight of Carl's words stung. He had anticipated their concerns, but hearing them out loud made them real in a way he couldn't ignore. I'm doing what's necessary, James replied, his voice firm but laced with a tired edge. This company has been built on a foundation of fear and exploitation for too long. It's time for that to change, and if that makes some people uncomfortable, then so be it. But the market doesn't care about your personal vendetta against a few bad apples, Carl shot back, his tone growing sharper. Investors are getting nervous. We're on the brink of a PR disaster. The murmurs around the table grew louder, and James could feel the tide of support pulling away from him, piece by piece. His actions, once driven by a righteous sense of justice, now appeared more reckless. His plan to root out the toxic culture was making waves, but at what cost? James glanced at the others in the room, his colleagues, friends even, but their faces were unreadable. The board had been split when he first brought this plan to light. Some had agreed that the company needed a drastic change, but now, as reality set in, many were questioning if the price was too high. Sarah's emotional turmoil across the city. In the quiet of her home, Sarah sat alone in their living room, a cold cup of coffee in her hand. She hadn't been able to focus on much since the media had picked up on the company's internal upheaval. She had always supported James, believed in his vision and his integrity, but as the backlash spread, a new feeling crept into her heart. Guilt. The media frenzy that followed had been swift and unforgiving. Headlines screamed about corporate chaos, reckless leadership, and even a power struggle fueled by personal vendettas. Sarah's phone buzzed constantly, with texts from friends and family, some expressing concern, others accusing James of going too far. The weight of the scrutiny was unbearable. The reports on TV made her feel like a spectator to her own life, her every move analyzed, scrutinized. She had known her husband had a temper, a passion that sometimes veered toward the unyielding. But had he crossed a line? Was he so intent on making things right that he was destroying everything they'd worked for? Sarah wanted to believe in him, wanted to stand by him as he'd always stood by her, but the cracks in their perfect image were starting to show. She was torn between the man she loved and the man who had dragged her into a storm of controversy. The guilt was suffocating. Was she complicit in this? Had she silently encouraged him when he needed someone to rein him in? She thought back to all the times she had supported his decisions, certain they were the right ones. Was she wrong? Was this the fallout from their combined ambition, and if so, was it worth it? James's resolve. The next few days were a blur for James. Internal emails flooded his inbox, calling for damage control. Some employees were speaking out against the new policies, and shareholders were growing restless. The public response was divided, some praised his bold stance, others condemned it as reckless. James paced the halls of the office, the weight of his actions pressing heavily on his chest. There were moments, brief, fleeting moments, when self-doubt crept in. Had he been too harsh? Had he taken things too far? But when he thought about Sarah, about the bullying and harassment he had seen firsthand, the answer was clear. No. He had made the right decision. The company needed to change, not just for the sake of profits but for the dignity of the people working within it. If that meant facing the fallout, then so be it. He had seen firsthand how toxic environments poisoned ambition, how power dynamics destroyed people, how silence enabled abuse. The fight wasn't about personal vendettas or petty grudges, it was about the future of the company, and most importantly, about doing the right thing. "I'm not backing down," he muttered to himself as he stood at the window of his office, looking out over the skyline. "I'll weather this storm." The board's pressure was mounting, and the media was relentless, but the more James thought about the future, the more resolute he became. He had done this for the right reasons. He had made a promise to Sarah, to the employees, to everyone who had suffered in silence. This battle was bigger than his career. It was about leaving a legacy, one that wasn't defined by profits or accolades, but by the kind of culture he wanted to build. End of chapter. Public press conference. A week later, James stood before a crowded room, the weight of the media's scrutiny pressing down on him like a tangible force. Flashbulbs popped as cameras clicked, capturing every angle of his every move. The room buzzed with anticipation, reporters poised to fire off their questions. James cleared his throat, adjusting the microphone in front of him. Sarah was seated in the front row, her face a mixture of pride and concern. She hadn't wanted him to go public with this, but he had insisted. If he was going to face the fallout, he would do it on his own terms. The room fell silent as he spoke. "Thank you all for being here," James began, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "I know that recent decisions I've made have stirred controversy. I've heard the criticisms, the concerns, and I understand them. But let me be clear, my goal, from the very beginning, has been to build a company where dignity, respect, and integrity are not just ideals, but standards." He paused, letting the words settle. He could feel the tension in the room, but he pressed on. "The culture that existed here before I took charge was one that allowed harassment, inequality, and fear to thrive. I will not be part of an institution that tolerates such things. Change is difficult, but it is necessary. I will stand by these decisions, and I will continue to fight for the future of this company no matter the cost." The murmurs in the room were audible now. Some reporters were scribbling notes, others exchanged looks of disbelief. But James didn't care. He had made his case. "Thank you," he said, stepping away from the podium. The camera flashes continued to light up the room as he exited, but inside, he felt a sense of clarity. He had done what he believed was right. And no amount of public backlash could shake that. The deeper struggle. Sarah stared out the window of her small apartment, the city lights flickering like distant stars in the night sky. The weight of her thoughts felt heavier than ever. She had been overthinking for days, weeks, maybe. Ever since James had taken that step, the one that pushed him into a confrontation with the people who had tormented her for years, she'd been sinking deeper into the same pit of guilt and self-doubt she'd tried so hard to escape. It wasn't just the public outcry, the backlash from the people who had always seen her as the victim. It wasn't even the quiet whispers of those who said that James's actions had only made things worse. What plagued Sarah most was the feeling that, in some way, she was responsible for all of it. James's actions were born of love, she knew that. But why did he have to fight so hard for her? Why did it feel like he was doing it to prove something she hadn't even asked for? She curled her knees to her chest, hugging them tightly as the doubts began to swirl again. Was it pity? Was James's love for her really just a gesture of sympathy for her suffering? A desire to save her? Sarah couldn't shake the thought that she wasn't enough for him, not in the way that he deserved. She wasn't enough for anyone, and that scared her more than anything. She wasn't enough. She had heard it too many times growing up, from the people who had shaped her worldview, from the ones who had made her question her worth. The bullies at work. The silent judgment from her friends and family. The ever-present notion that she had to be someone else, someone better to fit in. But in this moment, it felt even worse. Now, it felt like she wasn't enough for James, the one person who had shown her what true love could look like. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the front door opening. James's familiar voice, gentle but concerned, called out her name. Sarah. She didn't answer right away. She wasn't ready to face him, wasn't ready to face the way she felt about herself. She couldn't even look at him without wondering if he saw her as weak, as broken. He walked in, his footsteps soft but deliberate, and then stopped just inside the doorway. There was a silence between them, thick and heavy, filled with unspoken words. Sarah, James said again, his tone quieter now, more searching. Talk to me. She finally looked up, her eyes red and raw from days of sleepless nights and silent tears. I don't know what to say, James. I don't know what's real anymore. James stepped closer, kneeling down beside her. You're real, Sarah. You're more real than anything I've ever known. But I need you to see that. I need you to believe that. Sarah shook her head, the flood of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. I don't think you understand. I'm just so tired of feeling like I'm not enough. I'm tired of feeling like everything I do is wrong. And now, you've gone and done all this for me, and I can't help but wonder, is this really because you love me? Or is it because you think I need saving? James's face softened, a mixture of frustration and tenderness in his eyes. Sarah, this isn't about pity. It's never been about pity. It's about respect. It's about the way I see you, who you are, who you've always been, even when you couldn't see it yourself. She looked at him, her heart aching with a mix of hope and doubt. But I don't know if I can believe that. I've spent my whole life thinking that I have to change for people to love me. That I have to be better than I am. But you've always seen something in me that I don't even see myself. I see everything in you, Sarah, James said firmly, his voice filled with raw sincerity. You don't need to change. Not for me, not for anyone. You've already been enough. I've been trying to prove something to myself, too. I never wanted to be a passive bystander while you were suffering. I wanted to stand with you, to fight with you. That's all I've ever wanted." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as his words hit her, cracking the walls she'd built around her heart. It wasn't pity. It wasn't about saving her. It was about love. Love in its purest form. James reached for her hand, his touch warm and steady. "I know you don't feel like you're enough right now. I know you feel like everything's falling apart. But I see the strength in you. I always have. And I won't let you believe anything less than that." Sarah sat in silence for a moment, her chest rising and falling with deep breaths as she processed what he'd said. His words echoed in her mind, slowly unraveling the tight knots of doubt and guilt that had taken hold of her. She realized something so simple, yet profound: she wasn't broken. She didn't need to be fixed. Her entire life had been spent trying to prove her worth to others, trying to fit into molds she didn't belong in. But now, in this moment, she felt a shift. Maybe it wasn't about being perfect. Maybe it was about owning who she was, flaws, insecurities, and all, and trusting that love could thrive even in the messiness of life. Her moment of clarity came quietly, like the calm after a storm. She didn't need to hide from her emotions anymore. She didn't need to run from the